All right, we'll get started. Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We're so happy to have you join us on our second webinar of this academic year. We hope that you and your families and your communities are staying healthy and safe and taking care of each other. And I'll start off with the land acknowledgement statement. So as a step towards honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the world, we acknowledge the ancestral, stolen, unceded territory of the Native people where you're joining us from, and you can do that in the chat. I'm participating from Chicago, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also call this area home. And this region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American communities in the United States resides in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of this city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black Lives Matter. We as Campus Compact commit to moving beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. So I'm so happy that you're part of today's webinar titled Four Curricular Lenses for Community Engagement, Equity, and Justice and Movement Building with our presenter, Kevin Kumashiro, who will be introducing himself shortly. Before Kevin gets started, I just want to do a few plugs for some of our upcoming programs. Please check out our featured initiatives. I'll throw it in the chat. We've got communities of practice. The anti-racism one, today is the last day, the 11th is the last day to apply. So if folks are interested, particularly BIPOC folks, because we like to create parity in that COP, we encourage you to apply, and I'll put that in the chat. Check out our credential program, and also it's proposal season for Compact 2022, our upcoming national virtual conference. So please check that out, and I hope to see submissions from folks. I'll turn it over to Kevin now. Kevin?
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Campus Compact and to Marisol Morales and Elaine Ikeda, everyone who's made it possible for me to be here. I'm thrilled to join you, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to join this, this webinar. I'm joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area, the unceded lands of the Ohlone and other indigenous tribes, and I wish to express I wish to honor the original stewards of these lands, as well as to express my solidarity with ongoing struggles for sovereignty, decolonization, and justice. You know, if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about myself, I'm going to use the chat to post some of the notes as I go along, and to invite you. I invite you to also share, to introduce yourselves, share where you're coming from, and also to post in the chat resources, questions, and thoughts as I go through my presentation. So a little bit about myself. I most recently was the Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. Now I work as a consultant, an educational consultant, and a lot of my work really focuses on how we advance diversity, equity, and justice through education, particularly drawing on themes of movement building. So the topic that I wanted to explore today with all of you is what I'll post right now. I want to talk about 4 curricular lenses for centering community engagement, equity, justice, and movement building. So why lenses? Why do I use the term lenses? I know some of you on here, I'm seeing I know some familiar faces and names are here. So you've heard me tell this story before, but what I like to say is that when I was growing up, if 2 people were dating one another, sometimes those 2 people might have had our song, right? A song that has special meaning because maybe it was the first song you danced to or the first song that you had dinner to or whatever. And every time the two of you hear that song on the radio, you both go, oh, until you break up with that person. And then, am I right? You don't want to hear that song anymore. So that to me is a perfect example of how our life experiences are constantly creating unique lenses that we look through to make sense of the world around us. Lenses that are colored by our childhood upbringing, our cultural background, our educational experiences, our professional training. It's why the same person can listen to the same song at different times in their lives and respond very differently. It's also why two people can watch the same movie or listen to the same presentation and respond, learn, feel very differently. We're all looking, each of us are looking through unique, partial, ever-changing lenses. And the job of education isn't to get everyone to look through my lens as the teacher. No, the job of education is to build our capacity to examine the partiality of any lens that we use, what it makes possible and what it does not make possible, what it allows us to see and what it closes off our ability to see. So that being said, what I wanted to do was invite you to try on 4 lenses or to explore with me 4 concepts that I have found particularly helpful for thinking about curriculum as it advances these different goals around equity and justice. So here are the 4 lenses that I'd like to talk about. One is naming the moment in our intervention. The second is diving into contradiction. The third is addressing legacies and levels. And the fourth is learning through discomfort and crisis and resistance, learning through discomfort and resistance. Sometimes I use the term learning through crisis. So I'm going to use the chat box as you see to post my notes, as I said, and please do feel free though to introduce yourselves, who you are, what kind of work you're doing, where you're joining us from, as well as throughout my presentation to post your own thoughts and responses, questions that are coming up for you, and resources that you'd like to share. I'm going to talk about each of the lenses by telling a quick story, sharing some examples, pointing you to some resources, and then leaving or ending each sort of presentation, mini presentation about the lens by pointing to a question that I'm going to urge folks to grapple with, both during the webinar and when you leave. Okay? So hopefully, if you're interested in taking notes, you're able to kind of copy and paste or see more clearly what I'm talking about by referencing both the chat and by listening. Lens number 1 is what I'm calling naming the moment and our intervention. So the story I want to tell is that when I was at different institutions, including when I was a dean, one of the things that I would say to the faculty and staff at the college was that we were proud of the fact that many of the programs that we taught, that we offered, were created and had been in existence and had been popular for 10, 20, 30, in some cases around 40 years. Those programs were likely created to respond to particular needs at the time that they were created. And my question was, well, how do we know that we're still responding to the needs of our constituents, the needs that are around us? And for that matter, how do we know that we're having the kind of impact or making the kind of intervention in the world that we want to be making? Like, why our university? Why would someone want to study here? Why would someone want to teach here? Why would someone want to partner with us? And on what basis are we making the argument that we're actually of use, that we're actually of value in the world? You know, last spring, I think it was really telling that we had so many, pretty much the world shut down, right? As the pandemic was spreading around and it was unsafe to teach, and we shifted to online learning. But we didn't only do that. What many universities and colleges did is they scaled back. They started to let faculty and staff go. They started to close down programs. They started to offer less services. And what I and many were arguing is that at a time when we needed universities to do more, universities were actually doing less. And why that's such a problem, I mean, that's a problem in general, but it's particularly a problem for higher education because higher education is so often criticized, for rightfully so, criticized for being very ivory tower, very disconnected, and in many ways very irrelevant or not impactful in the world. I think what the pandemic and the subsequent closures caused me to ask is, what is it about the moment that we find ourselves in that we believe universities need to be addressing, right? How is it that universities need to be doing more to address the contexts that we find ourselves in, particularly if we are trying to make the claim that our universities are adding value to the world? Let me give some examples of how I try to name the moment. I've already mentioned that we're in a moment of a pandemic. Universities and colleges and schools across the world shuttered, moved to online learning. Most in the US have reopened, but the pandemic, as I think many have argued, did a lot to highlight as well as to exacerbate existing inequities. Inequities around access to technology and learning, but also inequities around opportunities to profiteer off of the move to privatize in public schools, right? This is a moment when, in the US in particular, we saw a wave of legislative attacks on teaching and against critical race theory in particular. This is a moment of increased visibility of US-led wars and of the US role in so-called nation building around the world or nation destruction around the world over the last few decades. This is a moment with heightened visibility of the attacks on democratic institutions. This is a moment of increased conversation and attention to policing and incarceration, not only in larger society, but in educational institutions. This is a moment of increased awareness of the climate crisis and increased urgency. I was once at a talk, for example, where the keynote speaker said, you know, our planet might not be inhabitable in a few decades. How is it that educational institutions can justify going on with business as usual? With the pandemic, we saw not only rising visibility of, but also rising levels of unemployment, of housing insecurity, of food insecurity. We have greater awareness of the mental health crisis among children, but also among educators. We saw the defunding of schools happening during the pandemic, as well as widening opportunities to profiteer. We saw the shift to online education, which also can exacerbate inequities. So lots of ways that we can try to name the moment, all of it come to bear on education. And on the flip side, all that call on education to do more. So I'm calling this lens naming the moment. Let me point to three resources that I have found helpful for thinking about why it's important to name the moment. One is a scholar that many of you are familiar with, the great Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, who in the late 1960s wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It was translated into English in 1970. One of the arguments that Freire makes is that we should not dive too quickly down a path to solve a problem until we first more deeply understand what that problem is. He calls this reading the world, and I'm using the term naming the moment. Freire's argument is that we need to take the time to tell our own story of what the problems are. Otherwise, we might end up buying into someone else's story of what the problem is, which means that the solution might not actually make things any better. The second resource I'll point to builds on this idea. This is going to sound super self-promotional because it's my own recent book, but my most recent book that I wrote is called Surrendered, and the subtitle is Why Progressives Are Losing the Biggest Battles in Education. And my main argument of why those on the left, liberals, progressives, are often failing to substantially change public education is because we often fail to tell our own story. We're often stuck in someone else's framing of the problem. And this applies to the coronavirus pandemic as well. So the third resource I'll point to is a video called Coronavirus Capitalism that you can see if you go to YouTube and the channel called The Intercept. At The Intercept is the name of the channel on YouTube, where you can see this video called Coronavirus Capitalism that features the amazing scholar Naomi Klein. And Klein reminds us of what Milton Friedman, the economist from the mid-1900s, argued in the 1950s, where he argues basically that how a society responds to a crisis depends on the stories available to us at that moment. And if the only stories about how we understand the problem and what we think the solutions can be, if the only stories about those things that are available to us are the stories that come from those in positions of power or those who already dominate, it's not surprising that the response we have to crises will simply double down on what's already problematic. We'll simply return to normalcy with all that is problematic about the norms, right? In fact, this reminds me of I'll put this here as well, one of my favorite writers, Arundhati Roy, who wrote in the early months of the pandemic. She wrote an article called "The Pandemic is a Portal." And you can find this reposted all over the internet. And Arundhati Roy's comment or sort of argument is that a pandemic is an opportunity, right, to pause. What often happens in a moment of crisis, however, is that we pause and then we rush to return to normalcy. And her argument is that in that rush to return to normalcy, we actually rush to return and we double down on a lot of the really problematic things that define the norm, right? Her argument is that a moment of crisis and the moment of pause that comes with that, we need to insist that we use that pause to envision a different way forward, right? The pandemic can be a portal to a different future, right? And our job is to insist that we make that pivot. Some of the recent work that I've done with scholars around the country is all about trying to name the moment and tell a different story about what's going on. So if you go to my website, I link to a lot of these statements that came out within the last year that are all about trying to tell or trying to define the problem differently, right? So some recent statements, there's a couple of briefs that examine the background to all the legislative attacks on critical race theory, background on the broader attacks on curriculum and teaching. We look at this, some of you are familiar, back in the spring, there's like over 100 bills that were proposed that were attacking trans youth. In the final months of the Trump administration, there was a lot of rhetoric around that really echoed white supremacy in the curriculum. There's a brief in there that looks at a lot of so-called reforms for communities of color and how a lot of these are backed by billionaires and see these reforms as opportunity to profiteer. The shift to online education and how that exacerbated inequities during the beginning of the pandemic, but even earlier this year with a new Democratic administration, what was one of the things that we did? It's exactly what all of these other scholars are talking about. We rushed to return to normal by reopening schools. And one of the things we doubled down on was high stakes testing in the midst of a pandemic. With all the research that tells us why that is such a problematic thing to do. But that's what we did as a country, right? Or at least that's what the federal government did. And there's also a brief in there about the rising attacks on Asian Americans and how the pandemic fueled anti-Asian rhetoric. Naming the moment. Naming the moment is an incredibly important lens because it calls on us to clarify the intervention we wish to make in this moment. So the question that I urge us to sort of marinate on as you think about this particular lens is this: how do you name this moment? Like if you were giving this presentation, what would you say defines this moment that we're in? And given the capacities and limitations of your university or college, what do you believe should be the intervention? One of the ways that we name the moment, one of the ways I have found most helpful for naming the moment is with lens number 2. Sometimes we think that naming the moment is about telling a kind of a graspable, seamless, uncontroversial story. But that's not really what we should be doing. If we really want to dive into truth and the reality, then we should recognize that our stories will always be filled with contradiction. And our job isn't to wish that away, those contradictions away. Our job is actually to dive into them. So lens number 2 is what I'm calling diving into contradiction. And I see on the call is one of my classmates from my alma mater, University of Wisconsin-Madison. I just had to say that because one time I was giving a webinar and my friend put a note in the chat about Wisconsin-Madison. Why? Because I held up my mug. All right, anyway, so lens number 2, diving into contradiction. let me begin by sharing how I think about activism, because to me, activism is filled with contradictions. Think about identity politics or identity-based activism. Identity-based activism is about saying who I am and what I am fighting for. And does everyone see that you cannot do that without at least indirectly saying who I am not and what I am not fighting for? Right? Identity-based activism will always involve creating margins within the very communities that I purport to be advocating for, which is why an intersectional analysis and a relational analysis, right, looking at the connections between different issues and different communities, is incredibly important. Right? And for decades, intersectional feminists, Black feminists, and so on, have made arguments about why it's so important to look intersectionally, not just at the problem, like how racism intersects with, say, misogyny and sexism, but also at the solution, how anti-racist activism often can work in contradictory ways, right? Racism is all over. Racism doesn't simply disappear, doesn't suddenly disappear simply because you're now in an activist space, like say a feminist space, which is why feminist spaces can be characterized by white supremacy. And same, patriarchy doesn't disappear just because you're in an activist space, which is why anti-racist spaces can be also characterized by patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism, right? And this is part of what intersectionality urges us to think about, right? That the work is not additive. It's not like you do the anti-racist stuff and you do the anti-sexist stuff, and together we've solved the problem. No, because even anti-racist work can operate in contradictory ways. And this doesn't mean we give up on the activism. It means we dive into the sort of the understanding, the acknowledgement that there will always be such contradictions. So let's then apply this to education, because what I and many would argue is that education also is filled with contradictions, and anti-oppressive or justice-oriented education is also always filled with contradictions. And ironically, what I would argue is that it's when we dive into the contradictions that we most make progress. Let me talk then about just a few of the central contradictions that I see in education. One, at the macro level, I call this a central paradox of education. It's the purposes versus the functions. And what do I mean by that? So, purposes. Why education? Like, why do we want education? Well, many people today would say the purpose of schools and universities is to provide equal educational opportunity, or to level the playing field, or to prepare everyone to succeed. All great goals, right? However, if we look back in time, we will see that those were not the goals early on of education. Why? Especially with K-12. I know most of you, if not all of you, are in higher education, but at the K-12 level, although also at the higher education level, the earliest institutions weren't all about equal educational opportunity. Why? Because they weren't actually serving everyone. Earliest schools, but also earliest universities, they were actually serving only a small portion of the young people population. Public schools, for example, the earliest public schools, who were they open to? You had to be white and male and your family-owned property. And as we were forced to include more and more groups of students, students of color, girls, immigrants, so on, we just came up with more and more ways to divide and differentiate and sort them, such as through segregation and tracking, or through labeling and discipline. Today, we might say that the purpose of education is to provide equal educational opportunity. But historically, the function was to sort. We just came up with different ways of doing that over time. Now, this doesn't mean that we throw up our hands and give up on educational institutions, because at the same time that educational institutions serve this sorting function, they also serve the function of liberation and revolution. I mean, think about throughout the 20th century in countries around the world, where did resistance and revolution often find their seed? It was in university campuses. And think about in totalitarian regimes, who do those in power often attack because they know they challenge their dominant worldview? Well, it's journalists, it's judges, it's scientists, it's artists, and it's educators, right? It's people, and it's because we know that those institutions, their primary social function, in large part, is to challenge dominant stories, right? So a central paradox. We should surface, we should acknowledge that there's this tension, multiple purposes, multiple functions. But also, I think that when we dive into these sort of multiplicities is when we can really engage in education in productive ways. Let me be a little bit more specific with a second paradox. Many of you are instructors. All right, so another central, so a paradox is when two contradictory things coexist, right? So another central contradiction within education is with the curriculum. The formal curriculum is what I'm trying to teach. It's like when I write a lesson plan, that's my formal curriculum. The hidden curriculum are all the ways that I'm teaching that I may not even be aware and that I'm certainly not intending. What's an example? I might write a lesson plan that says we should treat boys and girls the same, like there should be gender equity in schools. That might be my formal curriculum. But if, let's say I'm in a kindergarten classroom, if the students notice that I'm asking the boys to move the tables and the girls to sweep, or we're reading mostly men authors and men in history, or it's mostly men who occupy the leadership and administrative roles in school, or the name calling is very gendered, or the boys sports teams have the more resources, all of these things are also teaching messages about gender equity. It's often gender inequity, but those are actually constituting what we would call the hidden curriculum. And what does research for decades argue? It's that the hidden curriculum is the far more powerful teacher, right? The hidden curriculum are communicating messages every day throughout the school that echo what they're hearing in larger society. The formal curriculum is my once a semester lesson about gender equity, right? So that's why, like, you know, it's so important to think about, if I want to address, say, gender equity, I can't just think about what I add through the formal curriculum. I actually have to think about how I rattle the hidden curriculum. But there's also, everyone see, you know, sometimes I do this presentation on the curriculum and I'm like, what do you all think? And people say, oh, okay, so my job is to not have a hidden curriculum. And I'm like, great goal. However, I don't think that's ever possible. Like, my argument, and the argument I think of many who do curriculum work, is that there is always a hidden curriculum. And what's particularly significant is that it's often things I don't even know is happening, right? Our job isn't to wish away the hidden curriculum. Our job is actually to dive into the contradiction that I'm always teaching things that exceed and even contradict what it is that I'm trying to relay, right? And a lot of my writings and a lot of the writings of many other scholars then try to flesh out, what does it mean to teach towards the hidden curriculum? The third paradox that I wanted to raise is this paradox about institutional change. Because those of you who study organizational development, higher education, sort of institutions and things like that, what is one of the things that we know? Well, it's that institutional change involves a lot of interesting and productive tensions. And here's one of those tensions. On the one hand, many people, like you walk into any college, any university, what do many people say? Things could be better. Many people will say, we want changes, right? They may not agree on what those changes are, but many people will say they want changes. Okay, what's the flip side of that? The flip side of that is that in many ways, people don't realize that they actually don't want a lot of significant changes. Why? Because of at least three reasons. One, many of us built the college and the university to be the way that it is. Many of us have contributed to designing the programs, designing the offices, hiring the people who are here, selecting the students who come here. We create the institutions that we work in. And even if you're brand new, that leads to my second point, is that we sustain. Our work sustains the university, right? And it defines what we think it means to be a staff member, a faculty member, an administrator, and so on. And here's the third point, why we resist. Because we often benefit from the institution. Even when we think we're all about social justice, anti-oppressive change, resisting the status quo, here's the reality. We benefit from working in the university, not only financially, but it benefits our sense of self, it benefits our sense of community, it benefits our sense of success. right? All of these things come simply from being a part of the university. And it's for all of these reasons that we have to acknowledge that we're actually invested in the university operating the way it is. So this is a central tension about institutional change. We often put out rhetoric and we might genuinely believe we want change, but what is the contrasting reality that without recognizing it, we often don't. We often, it's quite upsetting when then change starts to happen. So a lot, I think, of leadership studies and institutional change research is trying to say, well, then what does it mean to engage in change when we both want it and are invested in not seeing it? You don't wish away that complexity. You dive into that contradiction. That's what I'm trying to argue, I think, is a helpful reframing for what it means to do this work. So here's the question then that I'm urging us to think about. What are other contradictions? If you were to give this presentation, what would you say are some of the key contradictions or tensions that define or permeate colleges and universities in general, or your institution in particular, and what are ways to dive into those? One of the ways that we can, one more concrete way to identify some of these tensions is to break apart the work of the university. Is to, university is this big hot mass, not mass, or maybe sometimes it's a mess, but mass of work that's happening. So one of the ways that we try to understand and to strategize ways of changing is we disentangle the different parts of what's happening in a university, so, or a college, or a school. And this then leads to the third lens I want to talk about, which is what I'm calling addressing legacies and levels. So as I'm talking, feel free to, feel free to post in the chat. Thank you, Elaine, for getting us started. Feel free to post in the chat, like some of your responses to any of the questions that I'm posing. And hopefully we'll have time at the end for a little bit more conversation. Let me talk about addressing levels and legacies. So I have so far said that one of the, if you think historically about the function of schools and universities, they were often meant to socialize. Some of you study kind of international and comparative education. All right, what is one of the main themes of that entire field of research? It's that throughout the world, particularly in the modern era, when countries have created schooling systems for the masses, what was one of the primary functions or goals of those systems? It was to socialize. Right? It was to control, it was to teach people to fit into the societies that they're finding themselves in, right? So it's not surprising then that the US educational system, including higher education, echoes that legacy, right? The legacy of creating institutions to socialize. Well, educational institutions are also permeated with all sorts of other ideologies, right? Right now, certainly over the last few decades, universities have become increasingly neoliberal and increasingly corporatocratic, like shaped by the business sector. Universities, I already said, were grounded on white supremacy, on male supremacy, on class supremacy, and so on, right? And it's not surprising then that those ideologies persist. They continue to play out in our institutions, even when we think we've done a lot to challenge them. Let me give an example. So a lot of institutions talk about recruiting, and a lot of institutions of higher education, although I guess K-12 as well, talk about recruiting and retaining a more diverse student population, right? We want more, particularly more students of color in our universities. Okay, so what then do? We look at recruitment and outreach strategies. We look at how we tackle the admissions review process. We look at orientation and onboarding and things like that. And maybe we look at advising. So we look at, so am I right? Those are some of the key functions or services or activities of a university that we try to target when we talk about this issue or topic of recruiting and retaining a more diverse student population. What I would say in response is that if you were to look at a university, there's maybe 20 major things a university does. It engages in governance, in budgeting, in strategic planning. It has curriculum, it has extracurricular activities, it has residential or student life, it has community partnerships, faculty development, staff development, has a public voice, right, speaking out about public issues. It sometimes has direct service provision, health services, and so on. So it has all of these things constitute what happens on a college, and even more. And what I would argue, and many would, as I and many others have argued, all of those things actually impact the student experience. All of those things shape your ability and your success in recruiting and retaining a more diverse student population. So if all you do is focus on getting more students of color to come, and you haven't changed the curriculum or the climate or the professional development of the faculty or the quality of services offered through the many offices at a university, then aren't you simply recruiting a more diverse student population into an institution that still has not been designed to serve them, right? We created higher education institutions to serve a small sector. That's how I began my presentation, right? We didn't always serve everyone. And we need to actually look at whether all aspects of the university, not just admissions or not just advising, is serving a more diverse population. That's what I mean by saying that when we look at institutional change, what we actually need to do is engage in disentangling the different areas of work and then figuring out what it means to change any of those areas, particularly by beginning by asking, how do any of these areas of work, curriculum, partnerships, professional development, budgeting, how were they set up to perpetuate certain ideologies? How is it that we've defined research in only particular ways? How is it that we define merit and sort of qualifications to be a faculty member in only certain ways? And are we able to disentangle how those definitions of merit or qualification or desirability are infused with ideologies of sort of patriarchy, of white supremacy, of colonialism, and so on? That's our task, right? Is to understand the legacies of these different problems in all aspects of the university. Okay, so that's sort of the first point about legacies. And actually, if you want a resource, let me share one of these resources that I helped to create a few years ago. So a few years ago, I started this organization called Education Deans for Justice and Equity. It's a national network of deans of colleges of education throughout the United States. And a few years ago, we also created this framework. And the framework basically says the way you transform a college or a university is you break apart the different areas of work, and then you try to figure out, like, how does injustice permeate in any of these areas? And so it gives like 13 major areas of work: budgeting, curriculum, partnerships. And under each area, it lists a bunch of questions that we encourage institutions to dive into, right? And the first question in almost every list of questions gets at the topic of legacies. How has the way we budgeted long been defined by anti-democratic goals? Just as a side note, I don't know how many of you work with budgeting, but there's some trends right now in higher education to use different budgeting models. And one of those models is all about giving different entities a lot of autonomy. And people think this is a way to democratize budgeting. This is not a way to democratize budgeting. This budgeting model didn't come from the community-based organizations that are trying to do democratic shared governance. This comes from the corporate sector that is all about holding different aspects of the entity accountable, right? It was not about democratizing budgeting, and it was definitely not about thinking collectively about decision-making. So understanding these histories then becomes incredibly important. Let me take this one step further. So I'm talking about legacies of injustice within any area. Well, we should also think about levels of injustice within every area. So let me point to this resource that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and then I'll try to define what I mean by levels. So in the mid-90s, the faculty of the University of Massachusetts Amherst College of Education came up with a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. It's still in print in its whatever version now, but I want to talk about the opening chapter, because the opening chapter gives us a framework for thinking about injustices. And it talks about the different dimensions of diversity: race and racism, sex and sexism, right? Class and classism. But it also talks about different levels at which any of those isms play out. So sometimes I give this workshop, and I give a workshop and I say to people, let's brainstorm examples of racism, examples of racial injustice. Let's just go around the room and brainstorm. So we go around the room, and old school days, I'd use the chalkboard, but nowadays I would maybe have a wipe-off board or a whiteboard or maybe like a flip chart. And I would have 3 flip charts. And as I'm going around the room, I'm putting their responses in one of the 3 charts. And after I have about 20 responses, I step back and I say, all right, what defines each of these lists? And the 3 topics you see here is what I'm trying to get at. All of the examples of instances of racism and racial injustice that fall under the first list at the individual level would be things that are interpersonal interactions or internalizing stereotypes. So interpersonal interactions, it would be things like racist name calling from one person to another, or racist violence from one person to another, or like a store clerk following a person of color around because they're buying into the stereotype that a person of color is more likely to commit a crime, or like a school counselor who tells the Asian American student to take the math and computer science class because they're buying into the stereotype that Asians are better in math and computer science. Those are all examples of racism at the individual level. One time, this is several decades ago, I was talking to one of a teacher I used to teach with, and she said, so what are you studying in grad school? And I was like, oh, I'm looking at how homophobia plays out in schools. And she said, at our school, I don't really hear homophobic name calling, so I don't think we have that problem. And I felt like saying, I think you need to read this book put out by the UMass Amherst faculty, because they would say, yes, the name calling falls in one level at which homophobia plays out, but there's 2 other levels at which homophobia can play out, just like racism. And that gets to the second level of the institutional. At the institutional level, I would put the systemic and the structural, the curricular and the cultural, and policy. I'd put structural and systemic, curricular, cultural, policy. In other words, things that are bigger than just an individual. And a lot of these things are constituted by individual acts. So for example, a police officer pulling a Black driver over, what sometimes we will call driving while Black, the racial profiling that's happening in that traffic stop by that particular officer might be an individual act. But when you then compile the pattern of racialized traffic stops, that would be an example of a systemic problem that would fall under the level of the institutional. Right? An individual example would be the counselor telling the student, the Asian American student, to take the computer science class. But the patterns of racialized tracking in education is a systemic problem that falls under the institutional. In fact, let me give one more quick story. So one time I was doing a focus group for a college that wanted to do strategic planning. And so I was meeting with a bunch of students. And anytime I do this kind of work and you say to students, so tell me about your experiences here. It doesn't matter what college, almost always you're going to hear students say, this place is kind of racist. And so I'm like, okay, well, so tell me, why do you say that? And they might say things like, we have some faculty who say pretty racist things, or students might say racist things and then the faculty don't challenge them. So if I stop there, what would be the implication of what the solution would be? My understanding of the problem is all about individual bias and behavior. So the solution, you might say, would be, okay, well then we need to offer more bias and sensitivity training to our faculty, right? But what if I went back to the students and I said, okay, so I'm hearing you talk about the faculty. Can you tell me more though? Where else do you see race come up in your program? And I might prompt them to talk about the curriculum or the policies or the admission or the demographics of the students or the demographics of the faculty, or ceilings, and like hiring ceilings. And we might start to go, the climate, we might start to go into what's far more than just the behavior of individuals. In other words, we might be getting at the curricular or the policy or the cultural or the systemic. And so that is a second level at which racism plays out, right? Both of those, however, are driven by the third level. What informs the counselor speaking to the student, and what informs or shapes the patterns of racialized tracking are the stories that make possible those things, right? And this is then the ideological level. Level of ideology isn't just what we might narrowly define as political ideology. What this framework is offering is an understanding of ideology that basically includes things like cultural narratives or conventional wisdom or stereotypes or other kinds of scripts and stories, right? So the counselor telling the Asian American student to take the class, the computer science class, is an individual act. Patterns of racialized tracking throughout the educational system would be a systemic or institutional problem. But the stories that Asian Americans are better at math and science, that stereotype is the ideology. It's the narrative that's making possible the other two things, which is why when I do leadership trainings, when I do kind of strategic planning work with institutions, and when I do work with folks thinking about how you improve your curriculum, the thing I often say is, your job is to actually try to understand the problem at all three levels so that the solution you come up with tackles all three levels. Right? It's not just about bias and sensitivity training, although that's important. And it's not just about changing policies and protocols, although that's important as well. If you only change those two things, what I would argue is different behaviors would start to emerge and different policies might emerge that are still accomplishing the same underlying function. Your job is to actually make certain that you're understanding the narratives that drive those behaviors and policies. So define the problem at all three levels, come up with solutions that tackle all three levels. The question then that I'm urging folks to think about with this lens is this. If you were to choose an area for improvement, the student experience, the curriculum, demographics, whatever, can you identify how that problem manifests at each of the three levels, as well as how to address the problem at each of the three levels, and then to address the problem at each of the three levels. So far, I've been talking about how we understand and address problems. Let me then quickly point to my fourth lens, which is when we try to bring about change, what do we often encounter? We often encounter resistance. So one of my favorite movies is The Matrix. So I'm going to talk a little bit about The Matrix. One time I was giving a presentation and to a bunch of undergrads, and one of the students came up to me afterwards and said, okay, that was kind of interesting, but I think you need to update your references because that movie's kind of old. And I was like, yeah, I get that that student was born after it was made. So Matrix was made in 1999, by the way, in case you're wondering. All right, so Matrix is set several decades in the future. Computers have taken over the world, but computers need power to operate. So what is the battery source for the machines? Well, it's actually the human body. You may remember the scene, there's several scenes, where there's millions of pods, and in each pod is a human body, kind of in a coma, and we serve as the battery sources for machines. Most of us wouldn't choose to be a battery source in a coma. So how do the machines get us to do this? Well, they hook our brain to a computer simulation program that makes us think we're living several decades in the past. So the main character, Neo, is in the beginning of the movie, is given the red pill, blue pill choice. Take the blue pill, you go back to sleep, and you continue to think the real world is 1990s. But if you take the red pill, you'll wake up and you'll see what the real world is like. And he clearly chose the red pill so he could lead the battle against the machines. And what he learns is something that's very upsetting, right? It's that what he thought was real wasn't real at all. The real world was several decades in the future. Most humans are in comas. Those who have escaped are being hunted down by the machines. It's a dangerous, scary, harsh existence. And there's one scene where he gets so upset by what he learns that he stumbles backwards, falls to the ground and throws up. And I saw that scene and I thought, that scene captures one of my favorite theories in education that I'm calling learning through discomfort and crisis. This theory has these four major parts. One is that learning involves unlearning. Conventional wisdom tells us that learning happens when I don't know something, I go to a class and the teacher gives me something new. It's like they're depositing money in a bank account. They're depositing knowledge in my brain, right? But research tells us that that actually almost never happens. There's almost no topic on which we know nothing. we develop a sense of how the world works just by living in, observing in, participating in the world, right? So when you learn something new, you actually have to be skeptical. You have to question what you thought was the case in order to learn something new. You have to unlearn before you can actually learn, right? If you watch my hands, many young kids think this is addition, this. So why wouldn't you think that 2 + 2 is 22? You actually have to unlearn that in order to learn that 2 + 2 is actually 4. This leads to my second point, which is that unlearning can make us uncomfortable. I like picking up a book and thinking to myself, see, I always thought that was the case. And look, Marisol says that right here. I don't like picking up a book and learning I was wrong the whole time. But arguably, that's happening a lot in education, right? And the important part of this, the importance of this part of the theory is that the more invested I am in my learning, the more uncomfortable I might be when I have to question it. I'm a little uncomfortable if you tell me 2 + 2 isn't 22, it's actually 4. But I might be really uncomfortable if I believed that I got to where I am because I'm smarter and I worked harder than everyone else. And you're trying to now teach me to question the concept of meritocracy as you teach concepts like privilege, entitlement, and advantage. Yeah, that might make me really uncomfortable. And that leads to the third point, which is that discomfort can lead to resistance. When I'm uncomfortable and you're telling me something that's making me uncomfortable, I don't usually think to myself, wow, that's making me uncomfortable. Like, can you tell me more and make me more uncomfortable? That's not usually my response. My response is usually, wow, this is making me uncomfortable. I need to stop talking. I need to stop listening. I need to leave this conversation. And arguably, this is happening in education all the time. And does everyone see then that the more I try to teach in a conventional sense, like give you something, make you think a certain way, the more you might actually resist that very learning. Right? This is another central contradiction of teaching and learning. Right? So our job then, point number 4, is that education therefore needs to address resistance. We need to find ways to surface, to kind of make explicit that we anticipate that as we try to teach and learn something new, we might encounter uncomfortable and resistant spaces. This is a curriculum theory, but you know what? Those of you who study psychology, this should sound familiar because a lot of psychologists also talk about how the process of change can lead us through stages of discomfort and resistance. Some of you study organizational development. Doesn't this also tell you in the 5 stages of organizational change that it involves people entering uncomfortable, resistant spaces? And so too with those of you who study social movement theory. Isn't that one of the major arguments that when we try to change societies, what are one thing we should expect from all sectors? It's experiences of discomfort and resistance. In my final minutes, let me just share a few resources. So one of the places where I talk about this theory of discomfort and resistance is in one of my first books called Against Common Sense. And I'm trying to argue here that this is not just a central theory for us to think about what happens in our classrooms. It's also a central theory for us to think about how we engage in institutional change at the more macro level. Here then is the question that I urge us to reflect on with this particular lens. When have we experienced or observed discomfort and resistance when undergoing assessment and transformation? And what might be ways to help students and colleagues to work through those stuck places? My final point that I want to make is that everything that I'm talking about actually draws a lot on an alternative framework for thinking about our work in higher education. You know, so much of what we do in higher education right now and in K-12 education is driven by corporate models of efficiency, of effectiveness, and so on. And what I'm trying to argue is that I believe social movements offers us a different way, a different framework for thinking about how we can engage our work in education, a different model, right? Different concepts for doing this work. And so one of the places where I try to flesh this out is in the book I mentioned previously, which is my most recent book, Surrendered, why progressives are losing the biggest battles in education. And so the question that I urge us to reflect on with this final point is the question of what can we learn from social movements to help us to assess, to reorient, and to transform who we are and what it is that we aspire to do. So these then are some of the concepts, some of the questions, the challenges, as well as the opportunities that I urge us to engage in as we urge us to grapple with as we engage in this important work. And I hope that this presentation helps in that effort. As we leave, I hope you'll take these questions, dive into them. I know we have a few more minutes before I turn the microphone back to Marisol. So if there are any questions or comments, please feel free to share with one another in the in the chat, or if you want to write a question directly to me in the Q&A, please feel free to do so. But what are folks' thoughts about 4 lenses for engaging in this work? As you're thinking, as you're writing, one of the thoughts that comes to mind, I'm sometimes asked, you know, and Marisol can answer the question about the recording. I'm sometimes asked, like, so what is the next step? And, you know, I'm a big fan. If you look at social movement research, I think one of the things that I'm really compelled by when I look to social movements is that we are so much more effective at transforming society and transforming institutions when we act collectively, when we engage in consciousness raising and policy action collectively. So the first step then is to build our capacity to act collectively. And so much of what happens in higher education is like highly siloed, right? It's hyper individualized, it's hyper siloed. So breaking down those walls so that we can do more work together, I think is a really important first step. We need to teach collectively. We need to advocate collectively. We need to lead collectively. And so that, I think, is the urging that I'll leave with all of you. It's been such a treat and a pleasure and a privilege to be able to join Campus Compact and to share some of these ideas. And I hope these lenses and these questions are helpful in the work that lies ahead. So thanks everyone for joining. I'll hand the microphone back to Marisol.
Thanks, Evan. We still have a few more minutes. There is a question in the chat for you, and in the Q&A. It says, what tips or ways of navigating resistance do you recommend?
Yeah, thank you, Anya, for that question. So what are ways to navigate resistance? So when I used to be an instructor, I started to begin every course that I taught by talking about this theory of learning through discomfort and crisis, because I wanted to offer a framework that we could constantly return to as we entered into those uncomfortable moments. So I actually think forefronting how you think about the process of teaching and learning itself, that kind of a meta conversation, I think is important in our courses. Don't just talk about racism, talk about what it means to talk about racism, right? But I also think that that applies then to institutional change, that one of the things that we need to engage in as an institution is to talk about what we think it means to go through change. And since part of the change process involves discomfort and resistance, I think as an institution, just like in a course, you need to be having a conversation about changing through discomfort and resistance. What does it mean to build up our capacity to be vulnerable, to share, to strategize together, to act collectively? So I think that's one thought I have as I think about your question.
Thanks, Kevin. You know, for me, it's so interesting listening to your presentation and thinking about higher ed leadership, and particularly like, how do you get it to think collectively when so much of the way that it's been structured has been around individuals or in siloed manners. We celebrate individualism in ways that are contradicting to, right, sort of even democracy or democratic thought and collectivity. And so it's an interesting paradox that we find ourselves in, especially during this moment. So thank you so much for sharing this. I know there were a lot of comments in the chat, and we look forward. We will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website in a few weeks. And so be on the lookout for that. Again, many thanks to you, Kevin, for sharing. And you're always welcome back to Campus Compact and to the webinars. And maybe we can even do a podcast. Sounds good. Thank you so much. Thank you, webinar attendees. Please be on the lookout and access our programs at compact.org. Have a good afternoon or evening.